Like the offense, the Carolina Panthers defense went through its own minor overhaul this offseason. How good will the Panthers defense be in 2024? I'll tell you right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter, at Julian Council, where on Fridays throughout the offseason, I'm right here on the show answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions, either at me or DM me on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for this week's edition of the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. Today's episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. On Monday, look at the Carolina Panthers overhaul on the offensive side of the ball. Today, let's look at the defense, as we have seen a number of defensive starters depart this offseason, mainly Frankie Luvu, Brian Burns. Jeremy Chinn was someone who we felt like was going to have a big role in Carolina once Ejiro Evero came here this past offseason. That did not happen. Donte Jackson, he's no longer in Carolina as well. Von Bell, he also left. So let's look at the Panthers defense now post-draft as we head into OTAs, the mandatory minicamp, the final phase of the offseason period before we get to training camp at the end of July. But first, we got to look back on what the Panthers defense looked like last year to really understand what the expectation should be on this 2024 unit. And one of the biggest things that happened this offseason so far has been the retainment of Ejiro Evero and the rest of his staff. There was a lot of questions whether he was going to go to LA to be the Rams coordinator or if he was going to head to Green Bay to be the Packers coordinator. David Tepper, the Panthers owner, was not allowing Ejiro Evero to interview for any defensive coordinator jobs, though he was interviewing for head coaching jobs here in Carolina, in Seattle, and Atlanta. Did not get those jobs for a second cycle in a row. We'll see whether that happens to be the case again next year, as he is under contract for this season and next season. My expectation would still be, unless it's complete disaster and that Dave Canales cannot work with him, which I don't think is going to really be the case for Carolina at all this year, I would expect that Ejiro Evero is going to be trying to get a job, and very possible that he could be back again in 2025. So that was a coup for the Panthers to be able to keep him. It also was something where it basically ended up being that way because the owner wouldn't let him take a lateral job, and because he's a defensive coach in the NFL, owners are looking for offensive coaches. It wasn't like he had that good of an opportunity to get a head coaching job anyway. So we'll see whether that will turn around for him in 2025. But looking at the Panthers defense last year, my main question about them is, how good were they really? There's a lot of numbers that point to the Panthers defense being really good. There's numbers that point to them being just okay. And there's other numbers that point to them not being very good at all. So let's look at the good, the bad, and, well, the ugly, which is what we do after every Panthers game when we do our film review here on the show. Look back at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the game. Let's look at the good, the bad, the ugly of the defense last year, starting off with the positive, the good numbers. Total defense, the Panthers were fourth in the NFL when it came to total defense, which is yards allowed in a game. They did not give up that many. They were one of the top 5 defenses in that respect. And with that, they were 6th in yards per play allowed. We look at a lot of things like total defense and like rushing yards allowed, passing yards allowed. The better metric, if we're just looking at the basic stats, as I like to call them, is yards per play allowed. And the Panthers were 6th in the NFL a year ago when it came to that. Looking at the passing yards allowed, net passing yards allowed, they were 7th in the league, but they allowed the 3rd least passing yardage last season in the NFL. So both metrics have them as a top 10 passing defense, and that's without J.C. Horn. That's having C.J. Henderson, who missed some time. Von Bell missed time. You saw Xavier Woods miss time. DiCaprio Bootle had to come in and play. Deshaun Jameson had to come in and play. Troy Hill stepped up into a big role for the Panthers in that nickel spot. Jeremy Chinn wasn't even really a part of the operation at all defensively last year under Ejiro Evero. Alex Cook came in and had to play safety. Sam Franklin, with all of that happening for the Panthers last year, all the injuries in the secondary, they had a top 10 defense. Now, there's a reason why they were able to have those kind of numbers. It's those guys coming into the scheme and playing well. Also, maybe the fact the Panthers weren't great in other respects defensively, where they were always behind in the games. Do you need to pass that much? No, but you got to give credit when credit's due. And there's a lot of credit that goes out to Ejiro Evero, whose background is as a secondary coach, to where his secondary performed admirably, and if not sometimes really well, with the amount of injuries that they had last season. Penalized as far as that goes. We looked offensively. Offensively, the Panthers were the most penalized teams in the NFL. Defensively, they were the fourth least penalized defense. We talked about last season when the article came out about a Hunger Games culture and mentality at Bank of America Stadium, how the offensive side of the ball, they were not able to get on the same page. Cohesion, it was not there. Defensively, the complete opposite. The players were actually disciplined. The coaching staff was on the same page. There was not infighting, and that plays out with them being the fourth least penalized defense in the NFL last season. The next couple numbers are just okay. I don't see them as being good or bad, but they're just okay. The Panthers were 13th in yards per carry allowed when it came to the run game, but gave up the 10th most rushing yards. That certainly was not good, as they did struggle at periods of time during the season against the run, especially against Aaron Jones and the Packers late in the season. The first 6 games of the season allowed 130 yards plus to every single one of those opponents as they started off 0-6 heading into that bye. So defensively against the run, they were okay yards per carry allowed, but as far as giving up total yardage, they were 10th most allowed in the NFL. 14th in third down defense. That has been an area the Panthers have struggled in recent years. 14th right there in the middle of the league. Not bad at all. And this is another interesting one for me. Opponent time of possession. You would think, based off the numbers I'm going to give you here momentarily, that the Panthers really struggled defensively because they were on the field a lot. According to these stats I saw today, opponent time of possession was an average 28 minutes and 53 seconds, the 7th lowest in the NFL. In 2022, their opponents were on the field an average of 31 minutes and 33 seconds. So the Panthers, about 3 minutes, 2.5 minutes, I think actually on the dot, 2.5 minutes less on the field defensively in 2023 than they were in 2022, in a season where the offense was also inept. And last season, the offense was worse, but somehow the Panthers' offense was out on the field more than the Panthers' defense. That was a shocking stat to see, and I'm curious to see what it's going to look like heading into 2024, as there's going to be even more of an emphasis on running the football, which, as we know, in the NFL, clock does not stop until under 2 minutes in the second quarter and in the fourth quarter. Might that number even go down as far as opponent time of possession under Dave Canales this upcoming season? There's only one really bad stat I wanted to bring up. They allowed opponents to score in 37% of their drives, which was 22nd in the NFL. That kind of goes into the offense not being able to move the football, not putting the defense in advantageous situations, and good offenses in the league on a short field being able to capitalize. So that was not great for Carolina last year. Now, the ugly 28th in red zone defense, and that goes hand in hand to where they were positioned against these teams. When teams got into the red zone, they scored, which is a problem. They were 29th in scoring defense, mainly because when teams got to the red zone, they scored touchdowns. 29th in touchdowns per game, which goes right into the red zone defense and scoring defenses being 28th and 29th respectively. They were dead last in turnover percentage. They were dead last in hurry percentage, which can actually be misleading. The team that was right ahead of Carolina was had 3.4% hurry percentage last year. Baltimore had 3.8. Baltimore led the league in sacks, while Carolina was dead last in the league with sacks with 27 and 30th in the league in pressure percentage. So the ugly was real ugly when it comes to getting stops in the red zone, really just getting stops, period, as far as the scoring defense and giving up touchdowns and getting any sort of pressure on quarterbacks a year ago. The hope is that will be better. So they need to be much better in the red zone, get pressure on quarterbacks, and therein will lie to them getting a turnover, which we saw against Atlanta. Desmond Ridder made some bad decisions in that game, but when they got pressure, they're able to force some turnovers, something they did not do for the majority of the season. And what do you know? One of their 2 wins came in a game where they won the turnover battle against the Atlanta Falcons on that rain-soaked Sunday at Bank of America Stadium. Advanced metrics, the Panthers, 23rd in defensive EPA, so a bottom third defense in the league. I guess we'll see 32 divided by 3. So, yeah, about bottom third defense. 12th in pass defense EPA, and that checks out based off of just the normal stats we saw. 31st in run defense EPA, which is much worse than what they actually gave up last year rushing-wise when you just look at total yardage and yards per carry. Then DVOA, they were 25th in defensive DVOA. So total defense, it tells you the Panthers were a top 5 defense. The advanced metrics tell you they were a bottom third defense a year ago. And I've mentioned missed games for a lot of the guys who were starters and supposed to be key role players at the very least for Carolina. Shaq Thompson missed 15 games with a broken leg. J.C. Horn missed 11 games with a hamstring and then a foot against Jacksonville. Marquise Haynes barely had him all season long. He missed 10 games last year. Yetur Gross-Matos missed 5 games. Jeremy Chinn missed 5 games. C.J. Henderson missed 5 games. Von Bell missed 4 games. Xavier Woods missed 3 games. Brian Burns even missed a game. Of the defensive starters, the regulars who were out there every single game, Frankie Luvu, Derek Brown, Shai Tuttle. Those are the only 3 defensive starters to play and start in all 17 games. And the Panthers still found a way when it comes to just basic metrics to be 4th in total defense and 6th in yards per play allowed. But on the other side of the coin, they were advanced metrics wise, one of the worst defenses in the league as far as just looking at the bottom third, which is so interesting when you look at this unit. Because looking at them at the end of last season, it felt like the only reason Carolina was even in a position to beat Houston or to beat Atlanta, and even, well, they didn't play well against Green Bay, but to beat those 2 teams was because of how well the defense played. Now, they didn't play well against Jacksonville with C.J. Beathard as a quarterback, didn't play well against Green Bay in that game as well. They had their warts, but more often than not, post bye, I felt like this unit played above its head, especially considering the amount of injuries that they had last year. So there's an argument for the defense being good in Carolina last year. There's an argument for him being just okay. And there's an argument for the defense being bad. But you cannot have that conversation without pointing out all the numbers, which I just did, and taking into account the amount of key players that missed time defensively, where it really should be a hat tip that they weren't 32nd in defensive EPA or defensive DVOA, that they were even right there at 23rd and 25th, respectively, in those 2 metrics, and 4th in total defense last year in the NFL. So that's how good the Panthers defense was a year ago. It's really up to how you interpret those numbers. I think that they were okay. I don't think they were bad. I don't think they were great. I think they were good at times, but I think last year overall, they were just okay. And I was left fairly impressed with Ejiro Evero based off of the amount of time that those key players missed and some of the younger guys that came in, stepped up, and played really well in those situations, considering what the expectation level was for them when they took over those spots. My question is, heading into this year, what do you think the defense was good last year, bad last year? Can it be better without Brian Burns and Frankie Luvu? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. It's playoff time in the NBA, and NHL baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $150, win or lose. We got the NBA semifinals going on in each conference. Same thing with the NHL, the Stanley Cup playoffs. Hurricanes facing off against the Rangers. So plenty of y'all who listen to the show, I assume, are also Hurricane fans. So if you go out there and you bet on the Hurricanes to win or to lose, doesn't really matter. $150, win or lose, you get there in bonus bets from FanDuel. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Sports betting has been here since March 11th. I've been telling you pretty much on a daily basis to get over to FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So I've given you the numbers last year for the Panthers. I've given you the basic stats. I've given you the advanced metrics. I've given you the good, the bad, the mid, the ugly to make up your own mind on whether you think the Panthers defense was good. And the numbers are obviously important, but you have to sit there and watch the games. And you, as a dedicated Panther fan, obviously, well, I don't know if you watched every single game, and I deeply encouraged you when things were going awry. I'll do it for you. Just watch the podcast, listen to the podcast, go enjoy your Sunday. If this team is going to stress you out and make you upset and ruin your day, just go on, be happy elsewhere, but come back here and Julian will tell you how things went and hopefully tell you how things can get better, if ever, under David Tepper. So maybe you didn't sit there and watch every game, but you saw enough to make up your own determination of whether this was a good defense, an okay defense, or a bad defense. I think somewhere in between good and like okay, maybe not anything between okay and bad. I thought that based off of all that we saw last year injury-wise, this defense acquitted itself quite well under Ejiro Evero in the first year of that scheme. And I'm very curious to see what it looks like in year 2 of the scheme. The only thing about it, though, there's going to be a lot of new defensive faces in that unit this upcoming season. There were plenty of players who were advocating for Ejiro Evero and that staff to come back, and they got their wish. The problem is players like Brian Burns are no longer here. Frankie Luvu, no longer here. Donte Jackson, not here. Von Bell, not here. And to a lesser extent, Deshaun Williams, not here, but he was a starter on defensive line last year in Carolina. Their replacements are Jadeveon Clowney, DJ Woodham's here, Josie Jewell, Dane Jackson, Jordan Fuller / Nick Scott, however you want to look at the safety spot, and A'Shawn Robinson. Those are familiar names to the coaching staff. Now, Clowney, we know him because of his time growing up here in the Charlotte area, playing at Rock Hill High School, South Point High School in Rock Hill, going to South Carolina, being number 1 overall pick. Everyone knows who Clowney is. DJ Woodham, South Carolina Gamecock as well. Josie Jewell spent 1 year in Denver with Ejiro Evero as his DC. Dane Jackson, Dan Morgan wanted him badly in Buffalo in the 7th round. He's now here in Carolina. Jordan Fuller and Nick Scott, both of those guys have relationships with Ejiro Evero dating back to their time with the Rams. A'Shawn Robinson, same case. So there are players who are veterans coming in here with experience in a defensive scheme. So that should help as far as the transition. But you have to wonder whether the talent level is on par to what it was a year ago. I think in certain respects they have improved, and I think in certain respects they have gotten worse. Now, as far as this conversation goes, let's focus on the 2 biggest losses, Brian Burns and Frankie Luvu. My question heading to 2024 is, can this defense be better without Brian Burns and Frankie Luvu? Now, let's start off with Brian Burns. And this was somebody that we spent a lot of time talking about over the last 9-10 months or so about his contract situation in Carolina and whether he would get a new deal. As y'all know, I wanted to see him get a new deal. It did not happen. I didn't necessarily agree with the Panthers paying him $30 million, which the Giants ended up paying him. But I did feel like he was worth the investment. And when the Panthers turned down what they allegedly turned down from the Rams and all the opportunities they had to trade him outside of that, it didn't really make a lot of sense why they wouldn't just reward a player who was a captain, a really good player on the field. Didn't have the best season last year, understand that, but a good player in the field, good in the community. Those seem to be the kind of guys that you pay. And they just did that with Derek Brown, but they were not able to do that with Brian Burns. And that's a trade I do want to revisit when looking back at what the compensation ended up being and what they turned it into during the draft a couple weeks ago. So we'll get into that another point in time here on the show. But as far as today goes, I totally understand people not wanting to see Brian Burns get paid $30 million a year. Now, I don't necessarily understand the folks who are happy that he's gone and think that the team is better off without him in the short term and even in the long term. I just do not agree with that at all. I can't agree with some of the moves that have been made post trading Brian Burns to see how it's benefiting the Carolina Panthers. But right now, I still, while seeing that, don't necessarily agree with, I flat out don't agree with the Panthers being better off defensively as far as what that unit looks like without Brian Burns. Now, DJ Woodham, he was the first quasi Burns replacement. I look at him as more as a replacement for Ejiro Gross-Matos, and in some respects, and probably a lot of them, he's an upgrade over Gross-Matos, who was more of a edge setter who sometimes could give you some pressure off the edge, but not really. DJ Woodham has done that more with the Vikings in his first 4 years, and he's going to come in and show that kind of value, especially as like a starter, potentially for not just the next 2 seasons while he's under contract. The hope is that he'll produce this season and next season, get a new deal, and stick around for 3, maybe 4 more years after that, as he's now signed onto the first deal post his rookie contract. So we'll see how that works out. Now, he is coming off partially torn quad and will miss the offseason program. That is something that could slow him down heading into the year and impact his numbers. We'll see how that works out. But Jadeveon Clowney, he was the real headliner. He was the one that Panther fans desperately wanted to see in Carolina, and I understand it. He had an excellent season last year in Baltimore, 9.5 sacks on what was one of the best defenses in the league. The Ravens, as I mentioned earlier on the show, led the league in sacks, and Clowney was a big part of it, a game wrecker, and we really saw the talent that led to him be the number 1 pick in the draft. And it's been wild to see him go from being the number 1 pick in the draft to playing in Houston, being a Pro Bowler, to having gone to Seattle, to go to Cleveland, to go to Tennessee, to go to Baltimore, now in Carolina, that he's played on this many teams. I did not think that was going to be his fate. And I think it's fair to say that he has never lived up to the billing as a number 1 overall pick and what was expected out of him. You look at Myles Garrett, that's who I think we all felt like Jadeveon Clowney was going to be, and he has not been that. But does not mean that now, late in his career, going to be 31 this season, that he cannot fulfill that potential with a late career renaissance with 9.5 sacks last season, and then potentially carrying over that into maybe double-digit sacks this year and next year while he's under contract in Carolina. That is absolutely my hope. And he believes that if he's healthy, he's a Pro Bowler. Now, we just saw last year that that claim is false, as he was healthy, played every single game, had 9.5 sacks, and wasn't a Pro Bowler. Now, the hope is that he will play 17 games again this year and that he will end up being a Pro Bowler. Was Jadeveon Clowney better than Brian Burns last year? Yeah, I think it's hard to argue against it when you look at some of the numbers. Clowney was 18th graded edge rusher last season, according to Pro Football Focus. Brian Burns was 39th. You look at ESPN's pass rush win rate. Jadeveon Clowney was higher rated than Brian Burns was last year. He had more sacks than Burns. Pressure numbers were better than Burns. Like, there were a lot of numbers that pointed to last year him being better than Brian Burns. But I'm not necessarily concerned about whether he was better than him last year. I'm concerned about he's going to be better than him this year and in the future. And that's where I have my real doubts, because Brian Burns has never had a season with 2 or less sacks. Clowney has had 2 of those in his past 4 seasons. Burns has never played in fewer than 15 games. Clowney has only achieved that mark 3 times in his 10-year career. That's why he says if he's healthy, he's a Pro Bowler, because a lot of times he's not healthy. And the Panthers are bringing in 2 edge rushers to replace Burns and Gross-Matos. And Gross-Matos had his own injury issues. Burns didn't have those at all. But they're replacing those 2 guys with one player who's coming off an injury and another player who has dealt with a lot of injuries in his career. And you're hoping really for high-level production out of him, especially, in that being Jadeveon Clowney in 2024. So I'm not necessarily convinced that the pass rush numbers are going to improve. I expect them to look pretty similar to what they were last year. In the short term, that's going to make it seem like the Panthers don't miss Brian Burns. And I do think, as far as the run defense goes, Jadeveon Clowney is a major upgrade in that department over Burns, which isn't nothing to look at and scoff at. That's important, as this was not a great run defense, as I pointed out to you earlier when looking at EPA, having them ranked 31st out of 32 teams in the NFL. I just think long-term, they could have some serious questions as far as it goes being an edge rusher and getting pass rushing help. When you look at Clowney's not going to be here very long. Woodham, if he doesn't produce, may not be here very long. The Panthers are going to need to identify a top-tier pass rusher in future drafts for me to have my concerns subsided when it comes to not having Burns, a guy entering in his prime, as a long-term option there at the edge rusher spot. Now, Frankie Luvu, he's someone that I don't feel like is going to be easily replaced in Carolina, much like Burns. You might be able to get the production this season from Clowney, and who really mainly Clowney, but in from DJ Woodham as well. I'm more concerned about long-term. Like interim, I'm certainly concerned about how the Panthers replaced Frankie Luvu, who was the Tasmanian devil and just ran like a bat out of hell all the time around the field. Last 2 seasons, 236 combined tackles. The last 2 seasons for Josey Jewell, also 236 combined tackles in 3 less games played. So you look at that and you think, okay, not bad at all. Josey Jewell, Frankie Luvu, same kind of production. And matter of fact, Josey Jewell did it in less time. But where they're going to miss Frankie is in a way where I think they're going to miss Brian Burns down the line. Coming after the passer, getting pressure on the quarterback. Frankie had 12.5 sacks in the past 2 seasons, including 5.5 sacks last year. Josey Jewell has 5.5 sacks the past 2 seasons combined, including 2.5 in 2022 when Ejiro Evero was his DC. You look at a Pro Football Focus and the pass rushing grade. Luvu had a 90.1 last year. Jewell had a 71.3 last year, which ain't bad at all. That's pretty damn good, especially for a player where I don't think you're going to be thinking of him as being an ace kind of pass rusher as an off-ball linebacker. Last season, according to PFF, Luvu graded out as their 10th best linebacker. Jewell graded out as their 40th best linebacker. You even go to the year prior. Luvu was higher graded than Jewell. He was sitting at 16. Jewell was 25th. They've downgraded at that position with an older player and someone who I don't think is going to have the kind of charisma as Frankie Luvu had in that locker room the last couple of years. He's the perfect example of the kind of guy that you hope to identify, someone who you brought in to be a special teams player who came with the mentality of, I'm going to take somebody's job, and he did it. Took Jermaine Carter Jr.'s job, came in here, and he's played his ass off, and I wish him the best of luck in Washington. Wish he was here. I have my concerns about linebacker, certainly without Frankie Luvu and Shaq Thompson coming off of an injury. I don't think he's going to be easily replaceable. I think Jewell can be a good player for them. Not that great in coverage. We'll see how that works out. But they're certainly going to miss Frankie when it comes to pass rush. And I do think that maybe this year you may not feel that way about Brian Burns, but I do think over time the Panthers will come to learn that they miss Brian Burns a lot. But the defense wasn't the concern this offseason. The concern was fixing the offense. And there is an argument to be made, if it's even an argument at all, that the offensive rebuild came at the expense of the defense. Is the defense going to take a step back in 2024? It also depends on how you viewed the defense last year in 2023. We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. We've all been there either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard is not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a win. That's when you dig deep, lift your head up and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists and take as much of my friend's money as I possibly can. That's right. The smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards, compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. Make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. Charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Is the Carolina Panthers defense set to take a step back in 2024, or are they prepared to take a step forward with healthier players, guys who come into Carolina this offseason that have more familiarity with the scheme in year 2 of Ejiro Evero? It really depends on how you value the players that have come in and also how you value the guys who have exited Carolina and how you saw this team a year ago. I think the defense was an okay unit. I really expected not that much out of them once you saw the injuries, but I was left impressed by what Ejiro Evero was able to do in year 1 with that mass unit that he had here in Carolina. And I'm very excited to see what this defense looks like in 24. Although I do have my concerns, as I have kind of addressed throughout this podcast so far. Losing Burns, losing Luvu, don't feel great about that this year. Don't feel great about that even in 3 years' time, as I do think those are players who would have been pillars of this defense for the next couple of seasons alongside Derek Brown. And then at that point in time, potentially J.C. Horn, who still, he has 2 years left in Carolina at the very least, with the 5th-year option being exercised prior to the draft. So love to see that for him. Hopefully he can stay healthy, but that's one of my concerns. Looking up front, Derek Brown's back. That is phenomenal. Getting Jaden Crumedy from Mississippi State. We'll see what kind of role he has. Nick Thurman's coming back. LeBron Ray's coming back. Raekwon Williams is coming back. Those are some rotational pieces that did show a certain level of promise, especially Thurman last year. And I like the spots that they can play in again next year. But where is the high-level defensive tackle talent here in Carolina outside of Derek Brown? Shai Tuttle was largely forgettable last year. And if his contract wasn't the way it was, now he would not be in Carolina. A'Shawn Robinson, I do see him as being an upgrade. He has played in this game just like Deshaun Williams, but he's a younger player, and he's always been known for being a run stopper, something that Deshaun Williams struggled with mightily in Carolina. So they should be better against the run with those guys, plus Jadeveon Clowney coming to Carolina. That is important. I still have my concerns, though, of whether they're going to get consistent production outside of Derek Brown. And Lord knows if something happens to Derek Brown, I'm not going to wood. I don't want that to happen. This team is not going to be in a great spot depth-wise when it comes to their defensive tackles. But we did see a year ago that when called upon, a lot of the depth guys on this defense did step up, mainly in the secondary, but they did step up, and that should be encouraging heading into this year too under Ejiro Evero as the Panthers DC. I just, though, look at what the Panthers were able to do with their offensive line and the investment they made into them this offseason compared to what they did with the defensive line, and it's night and day. $89 million guaranteed to the two guards. They brought in a swing tackle. Yes, there's an investment that's been made in Derek Brown as far as his extension, which I'm very happy to see. They brought in A'Shawn Robinson, but it's a one-year deal. That is a question that I have about how good they're going to be up front. If they cannot stop the run, cannot control the line of scrimmage, they're not going to have success defensively at the level that we would hope that they could have, especially with as talented of a defensive mind as they have in Ejiro Evero. You get back to the second level there with linebacker, basically brought up my concerns about Luvu being replaced by Jewel. They got worse there. Shaq Thompson, he's coming off of an injury. We'll see what he's able to do. If those two guys stay healthy, they should be fine at the linebacker spot. I don't know whether Trevin Wallace is ready to step in and be a player who's going to really help them out. I don't know if Clyde Charles or if Chandler Wooten, even Michael Barrett, who they took in the 7th round, are guys that can step up and be ready to go if something were to happen to Shaq again or to Josie Jewell. That is a spot where I still feel like they're light and that they've gotten worse just based off of losing a talent like Frankie Luvu, who really was the heart and soul of that defense outside of Derek Brown up front. The secondary, I do have major concerns. As much as I'm happy to see J.C. Horn get the 5th-year option exercise, I still need to see him play. When we've seen him play, he's been good. The problem is, and I've said it so many times, we all say it all the time, he's just not available. If he can finally be available, that will certainly calm down my concerns. But right now, my concerns are not being quelled because I don't know if J.C. Horn is going to be able to play 15 games, let alone 16 or a full 17 game schedule. That's what I want to see out of him in 24 and what Dan Morgan and everyone in this organization, Dave Canales, really need to see out of him this upcoming season. There's still a major hole at the other corner spot. Dane Jackson, I'm sure there's belief in him within the organization and I'm sure within the fan base. But y'all always still want to see Stephon Gilmore. Talked about it yesterday, the report from Joe Person that there has been no movement there. And it feels like there's not going to be any movement until we get to August. And he's coming off of a significant injury with that labrum surgery that he's scheduled to have. I imagine he's already had it. Not quite sure whether that's been the case now, but if he's expecting to play or planning on playing this upcoming season, that would have been something he would have gotten taken care of way back then and maybe the reason why he's also a free agent right now, and he's older and doesn't want to waste his time dealing with the voluntary, then partially not voluntary offseason program that's ongoing across the NFL. But they don't get Gilmore. I don't know what they're going to do. J.C. Jackson's on the market. Talk about him. Adoree Jackson's also on the market. They don't bring in those guys. That could be a position that gets squirrely. I do understand DiCaprio Boodle, Deshaun Jameson, those guys stepped up last year. They brought in Charles Smith-Wade, who really shined out at the Senior Bowl, and that's a big reason why the Panthers took him in the 5th round. He's a versatile player. We'll see what Jamie Robinson's able to add as he's more of a safety. Maybe he can play nickel. What he did at Florida State for a couple seasons there in the ACC. Very curious to see how that works out and concerned about the cornerback spot. Secondary, Woods is a good player. The other two, Fuller and Nick Scott, mainly Fuller should be the starter. He started the last couple of years in LA. I don't know if either one of those guys. Really, Fuller is an upgrade from Von Bell, and Scott started last year in Cincinnati, then was terrible and got benched. Good to have depth like that as a veteran player who knows the scheme, but also a little concerning if you have to go to him. But that's really how things are for a lot of teams if you have to go to your backups. The Panthers have lacked depth. Some of the best teams really the best teams in the NFL have quality depth. The Panthers, there's always been questions about where their depth is and if they do have quality depth on the roster. And some of those concerns defensively, especially last year, were put to rest. So we'll see what it looks like this year. In all, I think the offensive rebuild has come at the expense of the defense. We see the investment made on offense with the Donte Jackson trade, with the amount of money they paid to Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt, getting 3 of their first picks in the draft, using those on offensive players, not really addressing the defense outside of extending Derek Brown and getting some bargain deals in free agency. Then later on in day 3 of the draft, Trevor Wallace is there on night 2. But aside from that, not like they did a lot. I like the moves as far as on paper and the fit in the scheme and the understanding of it. I just look at the talent drain that we've seen with Burns gone, Luvu gone, Chinn, who wasn't even being utilized, but I still think he's a good player. Donte, for what it's worth and what he was able to provide here, Von Bell. And I wonder where that talent ranks now compared to what they had last year, at least what they could have had last year had those guys been healthy. Derek Brown's still here. He's a premium player. JC Horn's still here. He's a premium player. Everyone else, questions about them, certainly, heading into 2024. And that's the case about a lot of spots on this roster, both on offense and on defense. But that's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday I'll be back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions, either at me or DM me to get those questions into me now. But in the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding, and I'll talk to y'all on Thursday.